Days Africa 2020 is about to go live.
And we are live. Hello to each and every one of you that have registered for this panel today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us as we unpack and we explore the future and the realities of podcasting, and I guess to a greater extent, media in general. So I'd like to thank Kaz Media and the Wits Radio Academy for their support of Radio Days Africa, and they are, of course, key to making all of this happen. My name is Refilwe Mpakanyane, and I'll be moderating this discussion today. And of course, you, our attendees, are key also and central to this discussion being a success. So if you're welcome to send your questions, your comments directly on the Zoom chat. And I think I may read out some of those questions as we go along, but most of those will also be banked for the Q&A session, which I think we'll have in the last 10 minutes of our panel discussion. And you can also send those voice notes to 079 528 0000. That number's 079 528 0000. Send those voice notes, those questions or comments, and interact with the panel. Of course, don't forget to hit us up on social media, and Twitter's Radio Days Africa 2020, and that hashtag is RDA 2020, as well as hashtag the new normal. So housekeeping is out of the way. Today's topic is online and on-demand podcasts for Africa. And we're going to be delving into the world of podcasting, or on-demand audio, as some people prefer to call it. And we're going to be unpacking our continent's relationship with this relatively new medium that's been with us for just under 20 years. Suffice to say, podcasting has come a very long way since Edison Research decided to start serving the needs of podcast networks, of agencies and consultancies about 14 years ago. So to help us talk and unpack all of this, I'd like to welcome Paula Rogo. Hi, Paula. Hi, Paula. Why am I not seeing you anymore? All right, let's move on from that. Kim Fox, hi, thank you for your time this afternoon. You're all the way in Cairo in Egypt, and it's such a pleasure to finally meet you virtually, but to see your face. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Kim Fox is a professor of practice in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and she primarily teaches audio production and other journalism courses as well. And Chris Martis joins us as well, and I'd like to welcome you, Chris. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, Chris is the CEO and partner at Hindenburg Systems. Chris has 30 years of experience in media production, entrepreneurship, management, as well as business development in London and Stockholm, as well as in Copenhagen. And then we bring it back home to Francois Retief in Cape Town. And Francois is the co-founder of iona.fm, one of the larger and I guess older podcast platforms in South Africa. So welcome to Radio Days Africa, Francois. It's a pleasure to speak to you again.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for making the time and also just helping us unpack what is, I think, an insanely exciting medium, an insanely exciting opportunity for Africans to tell their stories and to share their stories, not just with the world, but actually amongst ourselves, right? And start to finally unpack through our own voices how we want to be represented out there in the world. But I'm going to start with you. Kim, and just ask you how the recent organizing of Podfest Cairo actually went. Was it a success? And we'll delve into the specific realities of podcasts in Cairo in Egypt.
Yeah, I think what we'll end up talking about is the timing, because it was very instrumental, and it wasn't obviously planned out because COVID hit when it did, because we went on a bit of a partial lockdown the following weekend. So we were able to pull off Podfest Cairo in fine fashion. We had about 100 attendees. So that was very, very nice to get that community to come out and support the event. Yeah. And we had an international speaker, Hannah Alam from NPR in the US.
Lovely.
and lots of, talking about producing podcasts from concept to completion. And also we had a bit of a competition, trying to identify the next, Egyptian podcaster. We had some great prizes, lots of community support from businesses providing support, including Hindenburg. So we were pretty excited about it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really lovely to hear. And I guess in many ways, from your professional stance and perspective, what are the real opportunities for podcasts as a medium, especially as you teach it in Cairo?
I think it's wide open. I mean, and this is what I usually tell my students. The opportunity to produce good quality audio is definitely going to net you some results in terms of your audience, in terms of the ability to, we'll talk later, I'm sure, about monetizing.
Absolutely.
I think the potential for growth in the field, especially in Egypt, is huge, but it will take some creativity to pull that off.
Yeah. Chris, I want to move to you and talk to your own experience and the work that you do with Hindenburg as a company. You are primarily sort of business to business facing, but what is it about the democratization of the ability to create podcasts and enjoy podcasts that you feel so strongly about?
Just a quick correction. We have a 50-50 between B2C and B2B. So about half of us, number-wise, we have about 40,000 individuals that have Hindenburg, that they're using them to create podcasts or independent radio. And then we have a certain number of business radio stations and so on, just to get that. So we have our we're looking at the whole spectrum in that sense. And you're going to have to ask the question again, sorry.
Just tell us what you do at Hindenburg.
So primarily what we're trying to do is to provide a solution, software solution, an audio editor, recording editing solution, which allows people for a very small investment to record, edit, and produce a podcast, but without having to be sound engineers. So this is just as much relevant for radio journalists as it is for home businesses, podcasters, individuals. What we do is we automate a lot of the engineering, so level setting, EQ setting, noise reduction, and so on, and make it really easy for people to get their voice and opinion out via a podcast or a radio production.
Yeah, fantastic work. And I think as we go on, of course, we'll talk about other guys in the field that are doing the same thing and the sort of impact that you that are having on the medium of podcasting. Francois, you are in a very unique position from most of us, because I think the abiding theme that comes through in discussions about podcasts is that statistics are thin on the ground, and while we love the medium, whilst we're excited about the medium, we're in a very unique position where we want to find that sweet spot where we're able to do the work, make these podcasts, but also find ways to monetize. But just tell us, what Iona FM has been able to do from inception to 2020. I think you're muted, Frostel.
Sorry, unmuted. I just want to link over to Chris. I have to say I'm involved in a couple of podcasting groups, and all the guys are always talking about his software as, for podcasters is some of the best. So if I sort of have to take an average, it's very highly regarded. It's nice to have him on the panel.
Thank you.
I was, a little over a decade ago, I was designing large fleet management systems. And then one of the guys that worked with me said, you know what? I want to try PVR for radio because, I can never listen to this stuff when I want to. And out of that, we built a podcasting platform. And later on, we did streaming. We've always done advertising. And 10 years later, we've got over 1,200 content providers on our platform. We are still very strong in South Africa. So almost half of those are South Africans. And as you're saying, statistics are still quite difficult. It was wonderful to see Edison do the first South African infinite dial last year. Really interesting stats that came out of that. But we are in the unique position that we've got a large platform with actual stats, and while we have to be careful how we share things, I love being able to show people what's happening and what the trends are. I think anything that they say a rising tide lifts all the boats. So I think podcasting is still a new medium. We're still competing against large established industries, and anything that guarantees success for one component is going to be good for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of my role, I'm the Chief Operating Officer. So I do a diverse amount of things. I oversee the operational aspects, both to radio stations and to consumers. I work with advertising agencies. I manage large strategic projects. I give training to organizations and media groups. And I really enjoy also sitting in on the technical side, sitting with various organizations and podcasters and figuring out what do they need at that point and what is the best solution that one can provide for them.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to move on to Paula Rogo and say hi to you, Paula, now. Paula describes herself as a podcaster, pod producer, and podpreneur, building Africa's first Africa's first women-focused podcast network. Hi, Paula.
Hello, I'm excited to be here and connect with all of you today and discuss this wonderful world of podcasting.
It's an absolute pleasure, and it's really exciting to have you with us. Paula, talk to me about the work that you are doing specifically, and what the circumstances and the environment is in your home country.
Right. So I'm based in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, and my work with podcasting is two-pronged. First, it's in content creation and talent discovery within one of my companies, which is called Kali Media, which is focused on creating content specifically for women in East Africa. And in doing that work, I landed in podcasting and realized that it was a really great platform and medium in which to really create niche content for my audience, which is women in and around East Africa. But as I was building that out, I was trying to sort of, like you said, Kali Pods, which would be a women-focused podcast network. In trying to build that, I quickly realized that there were parts in the podcasting ecosystem within Kenya and within Africa that were missing in order for me to build the podcast network into the success that it needed to be. So I hit pause on that, ran over to the other side, and last year launched Africa Podfest, which is a podcast festival that was actually supposed to take place a week after Kim's Podfest Cairo, really. Yeah. And Kim slid right by and was able to have her podcast festival. And due to COVID and due to just regulations here in Kenya, we were just not able to have put together the podcast festival. But really the goal with Podfest is, of course, to create an event where people come from all over the continent, bring their ideas, their wisdom around podcasting from wherever they are on the continent, because we are all moving very differently in different countries. But also now, as we transition into a sort of year-round company, is how can we put African podcasters first and provide them resources, provide them services, and create a really vibrant ecosystem for podcasting to flourish in Africa. Because I really think, and I think everyone will agree with me, I really think this is the medium to take over mediums in the next few years in Africa.
Yeah. So, in many ways, I've asked you all these questions and a bit of your background, not to establish your bona fides, but just to show what an interesting array of panelists we have today, and your insights, the various insights that you bring to this conversation. I want to build on this point that you've just made, Paula, and whoever, I guess I'll start with Kim. The opportunity for podcasts on the continent for you is one that can be incredibly interesting and exciting. But for a very, very long time, we've tended to view podcasts as those archived, bits of interviews or audio from the radio, right? Of course, the sector's matured and we know it and understand it differently. But to a large extent, traditional media treats podcasting as audio archiving. And is it problematic for the growth of the medium, or is it just fine? It'll mature in time. What do you think, Kim?
No, I think it's fine the way it is. It's wonderful to have an archive. Think about, what we have access to from, the past. I do a lot of oral history and oral history projects, and those are really based on, we're creating an archive, we're creating a database that someone can then use to create different audio stories. So I think that kind of growth is always there, conducting interviews and creating a proper database for interviews and having that metadata, that's huge. It's really important. And the archiving of digital content is also extremely important. Do you realize how much content we've lost when systems change? So I think that's an important part of the archiving, again, whether it's for radio or for podcasts. And it definitely gives us the depth that we can go back and listen to that content that came before us.
Sure. So Francois, a large chunk of your clientele tends to be those radio stations, right? Or established traditional media and radio, and they're doing exactly that. They are archiving their interviews, they're archiving shows and bits of those shows. But of course, we know that the understanding that actually creating a standalone podcast with high production value is the way to go. Has there been, for the most part, a sense of podcasts being pitted against radio or just seen as a complementary part of that ecosystem?
I think a lot of the big radio stations go on and they do what they do. But if you talk to sort of a podcaster on the ground, so looking at sort of your podcast groups, they will be very, very vocal about the fact that, radio on demand is not the same as podcasting. But if you look at the two, radio content is created to slot into a specific time slot. It's typically, 15, 20 minutes, whatever. And that is really important. Whereas the big thing with podcasting is, you're not tied to a clock. You can take the time to tell the story. If you look at successful, like Radio Lab, for example, they've got episodes of 20 minutes and episodes of an hour and 20 minutes, depending on what the story is. And I'm excited to see that radio is evolving and they're starting to figure out that, for example, you can have the news that didn't make it into the news bulletin, or you have programs that are now made as podcast first, and then they cut them down to a portion and they broadcast a part of that. So I think podcasters have already figured out a lot of the stuff around how to use the medium. And I think radio's got the audience, they've got the backing in how to create great audio, and we find most of our top content providers come from a radio background. And they're learning to adapt and how to use this new medium to their maximum advantage.
Sure. And to that end, Paula, what I'm interested in is finding out from your Kenyan perspective is how are content trends, how do you view content trends in your environment and in your work? Because of course, I think the beauty, and you'll all agree I'm sure you'll all agree with this, is that the beauty of podcasts is the ability to be incredibly niche, right? To serve a very, very specific area of interest in a market and not have to worry about, getting everybody interested. So what are content trends looking like in your part of the world, Paula?
Yeah, and even just to even add to what you were talking about radio using podcasting initially to archive, that's really not the case here in Kenya. In fact, podcasting started more from independent podcasters, and radio has been very, very slow to even archive what they have on the air online. So it's very fascinating to sort of see the differences there. But and then because of that, what's happened within the podcasting space and content trends is that a lot of the popular podcasters and the podcasters who've really done well within at least the Kenyan context are those who offer content outside what the mainstream media is covering. So some of our podcasts we're talking about, for example, is the Afro Queer podcast, which talks about the LGBTQIA plus community around Africa. There was a really great podcast that's now right now on pause called the Otherwise podcast by Brenda Wamboi, which talked about politics and society in a way that our traditional media was not covering. So I think what people are looking for are new voices. They're looking for new opinions and looking for intimate spaces and niche spaces in which they can go connect with individuals who have something to say. And I think that's really what's been exciting about those content trends. And then also language. The opportunities for language podcasts, which we're slowly starting to see. Right now, podcasting is mainly among city-based, Nairobi-based, or capital-based socioeconomic strata, specific sort of upper middle-class strata who speak English, who podcast in English, but it's slowly starting to evolve, and it's beautiful to see the type of storytelling that's really coming out there.
Yeah. Well, language is key, is it not? Because we are pretty much Western facing when it comes to the media and the content that we consume. And it is a matter of economics, I guess, who's able to churn out how much content. And with the democratization or the lowered barrier to be able to creating podcasts, it really, really does make it easier for Africans to create their own vernacular podcasts. Chris, I'm curious from your perspective at Hindenburg, the ratio, the number of, I'm going to say non-English, and not that English is the norm, our normative sort of structure, but in many ways, I guess that's what we find ourselves in. It becomes the global lingua franca. From your perspective, what kind of ratio are we looking at of various podcasts being made and created in languages other than English?
Obviously, really difficult to answer, but from what we are seeing, so the US and North America has been our primary market for a long time, and that's changing clearly over the last 3 years. We're having a lot more pickup from other countries, which must indicate, obviously, that those languages are also getting strong in the podcasting field. So South America, Brazil, being another language, and I think the other side of the thing is that we also support a group called Cultural Survival, which is a group that supports indigenous media around the world, and we've been involved in that since the beginning. So, my stats are not necessarily reflective. So, we've been supporting projects in Nepal and in the Southeast Asian area, which are small indigenous populations, and equally in Central and South America. And their base is typically community radio,
sure,
but at a very, very inexpensive level, and where podcasting is kind of something that's coming out of that. Mm-hmm. France, clearly French-speaking, Spanish-speaking is growing. In terms of Southern Africa or Africa in general, what I'm seeing is still a lot of Anglo-centric communities that are producing in English and so on, rather than local languages. And that's one of the areas that a large part of what Hindenburg is trying to do is to, as you mentioned, democratize access to audio and audio storytelling, which means we're trying to specifically address a lot of smaller groups that wouldn't have the funding to be able to create an oral history or storytelling in general in their local language. Whereas, with a little bit of Hindenburg and a cheap mic and access to something like iona to host your software, now all of a sudden somebody living in Pondoland can create something in in their local language, but still, and this is an important part, still have or maybe increase their reach, because all of a sudden there are people in New York, there are people in Europe, there are people in Australia who still have that as their background, and who are really hungry for news from home, from someone on the ground, not processed through all sorts of politicized media. Someone who's not necessarily not necessarily has a political angle, but just wants to say, this is what's going on around me, because that's what podcasters, if you like, traditionally have done, is try to describe it. I know we can't generalize here. There are a lot of very political in any storytelling medium, but you can find, or you can generate the ability for people very cheaply with podcasting to tell local stories and reach a global audience. So what the numbers are, I would be wary, but I see a lot more of it over the last 3 years. I see a lot more people writing to us in primarily still European languages. We don't get many support requests in Zulu yet, and I'd have to brush up a little before I could answer.
Absolutely.
But we definitely hear through Twitter and Facebook and so on, people coming from a much more diverse background, and hopefully we try to encourage them to use that as a strength rather than to graduate's not the right word, but to make another English language podcast. We've got enough of those, to be honest.
So, of course, we know that the barriers to entry to creating a podcast are low, and I guess will get increasingly lower as we go along and as more people innovate, right? Although, as you've just described, it's pretty easy. Have podcasts created an entrepreneurship opportunity on the continent that, of course, never existed before, but one that is scalable? And when I talk about scalable, I'm of course going to look to the States, and you can jump in here, Francois, as well. And the work that guys like Spotify, for instance, have done by cornering that market and saying, this is how we're going to differentiate ourselves. We're going to focus on podcasts. And not only are we going to focus on that, we're going to acquire a Gimlet Media, for instance, for $200 million. We're going to sign Joe Rogan for $100 million. He's a YouTuber and a podcaster as well. And then we're also going to, snap up the ringer, Bill Simmons, and look to reality TV stars like Kim Kardashian. We're clearly still, as a continent and industry, in our infancy. But I want to start by just asking what the opportunities that you are seeing on the horizon might be. Maybe let's start with you, Paula.
And do you mean opportunities in monetization?
Entrepreneurial and opportunities and monetization opportunities.
Right. So there's opportunity around content. There's opportunity around production. There's opportunity around technology. It's open, and you're seeing some of that. We're seeing, of course, Chris is here, of course, Francois with what he's doing, but we're also seeing different content creators or even platforms that are popping up in and around the continent. I think the thing that's key is learning from the West and then adapting to what is necessary for Africa. And that's those are the barriers that we're running into. Because yes, I can use Anchor. Yes, I can use Spotify, all these different products here, but what are the ways in which they don't speak to or allow the use for the African podcaster or the African audience? There are barriers, things like data. That's a huge barrier. You can make all the podcasts you want if people can't access, and the telecoms are not bought in to the potential of podcasting and how they can be involved. Even of the bigger platforms, yes, I'm so excited for you, Spotify, but you're not open to the rest of Africa, only within South Africa. So what are the limitations in which I can also distribute my content? And distribution is huge. The opportunities for distribution is immense. I'm very excited because recently in Kenya, we had our first podcaster who was syndicated by radio. Her name is Adele Onyango, and her show is called Legally Clueless. And she was able to syndicate her show after 1 year. And there is a monetization opportunity for her. And she's very specific about starting her podcast as a startup. She's looking at it as a way to make money. So this, in the same way one approaches any form of content creation, whether it's video and YouTube, whether it's blogging, podcasting also opens up the opportunities and has room for also innovation and creativity, which makes it even more exciting. We can create the spaces in which we can do that work.
Yeah. So Kim, how as you teach and as you lecture, how do you approach this with your students when you unpack all of this?
I guess I'm hopeful that the young people are coming in with creativity and they're, thinking outside of the box. And actually that's not true, which is very unfortunate because they really want to go down a traditional road. Like if I ask them, how are you going to monetize your podcast idea? And they'll say, oh, I'm going to post it on YouTube and we'll get some ad revenue from there. But I'm like, no, give me something that's really unique and creative and maybe takes advantage of fintech. And that's when they get sort of stuck. And I feel like we need to do a bit of a podcast hackathon so we can say, like, what are the unique ways that we're not tapping into that aren't so mainstream? I think about people who don't have a smartphone, but they may be interested in your content, how they get access to that. But in terms of monetizing and entrepreneurship, this is perfect because it gives people an opportunity to control their message, control their content, and control the whole thing until like Paula said, you get picked up and you start to get syndicated and find someone who wants to bring you to a higher level. And of course, we know nowadays you need to pay attention to your IP, intellectual property as it relates to that. But just trying to get people to get smarter about what they're doing. And the last comment I'll make before we move on is that Arabic podcasts have a lot of room for growth. It's growing. If I can share my screen right quick, we can look at some of the numbers.
Yeah, please do.
For Arabic podcasts, but it's not just for Egypt. So this number has pretty much doubled. This is self-reporting from a company out of the UAE. But what's more important is to look at the growth over the past few years, and then to look at what people are talking about. I had to have someone do a little bit of translation for me, but the big piece of the pie is the topic is social and talk. And the second topic is education and culture. So these are the primary topics right now. But again, these numbers are self-reported and growing. But in my opinion, this is where the growth is. That Chris mentioned, there's so much content in English. And when we think about trying to produce quality content in Arabic, I see it growing, but I definitely see it getting bigger in the next year even.
Can I just?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
So in particular, the Arabic-speaking podcasts have a huge opportunity because there are, as you know, there's a huge Arab-speaking population in Europe, at least, that is very focused still on having connections to their culture and so on. And I think that the person that can work out how to make a sponsored pay-per-listen, some sort of direct contribution from that, and have and create something that's very, very interesting for the local population, because you need that in order to get access to the next interesting content. You cannot be in Jordan and talk about Jordan without having an audience in Jordan that's going to be relevant. But funding-wise, there's a huge opportunity to go to the European Jordanians or Middle Eastern community and say, we want to bring you this, but we need some funding. The classic, any sort of clickbait. And that's what I think. When people ask me what I think is the greatest opportunity for monetizing something from Africa, I always talk about the fact that there's a huge expat community that is hungry for and has buying power. For them, at the end of the day, $1 here, $1 there. Yes, a lot of them are hardworking people but there's still that most of them have a satellite dish because they're trying to get Al Arabiya or something. If you can get them to cut that down, you've already got $50 a month you can spend on podcasting.
Well, then to that end, then my question to the panel becomes, are subscription-based podcasts the possible sort of low-hanging fruit to start looking at when we talk monetization? Because if you're not necessarily chasing sponsors or able to get advertisers, then a subscription-based approach the way to go? Or is it a feasible one in our very unique landscape? And we'll go to chatting about the cost of data, as well as the various mobile devices that we're consuming, or the devices we're consuming podcasts on. Maybe you can elaborate on that, Chris, and then I'll move on to Kim.
I don't have any basis to know, but if I were an entrepreneur starting a podcast, that's the low-hanging fruit that I would chase. So that's as an entrepreneur myself, that's what I would be looking at. Whether it's viable or not, I'm sure someone has more experience than me and has tried it, hopefully, because it would be really sad if I was bringing up unique ideas here. But I would try it out if I was if I was trying to make a vendor-based or Arabic-based podcast. That would be my first idea.
Kim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course you're going to try the subscription model. That's a given. But I really think diversification is going to be the best route to go. It takes a lot of people to diversify, but we're looking at, some people are using Patreon. I'm looking at what Kerning Cultures is doing out of the UAE, and they do a lot of stories that are Cairo-based as well. And what they're doing is just, trying out a lot of different things. And so, like I said, they've got the Patreon, they've got people who are doing, giving them small bits here and there. Maybe some sponsorship. I think sponsorship is certainly a way to go, where you can, there's another company out of Egypt called Enterprise, and they just have a handful of sponsors who sponsor the whole thing. They sponsor a season. And I think that's also a smart way to go. But I think diversification is going to be the best way to go to see what's working.
Paula, your own thoughts on the subscription-based approach and how it might work, for instance, in Kenya?
I think I agree with Kim in terms of diversification, but I think what people also need to understand is some people still don't even know what podcasts are. Like, the work I'm doing is education, is making sure that people first at least understand what the medium is before we really start climbing into some of these monetization opportunities that would also involve another level of education. Because when you're talking about subscription, we are assuming probably diaspora or someone of a certain socioeconomic class who understands and works in this space of subscription, right? If you're niche and you know who your audience is and subscription is part of their language, of course, it makes sense to go do that. But, and this is key because we actually did a study at Africa Podfest, a very small study about the diaspora as an audience with Kenyan podcasters, and this was last year, and I'm sure the numbers would have changed within 6 months alone, is majority of Kenyan podcasters, their listeners were actually not in Kenya. And that's because education is key. I still run into people who say, I've heard of the word podcast, I don't know what it is, but I'm embarrassed to admit that I don't know what a podcast is. So yes, I'm excited to, and even among big advertisers and corporates, the opportunities for sponsorship with them are not there if they don't even understand what a podcast is. And actually a big part of education for us is teaching corporates what podcasts are so they can actually buy into the medium. So I'm open to talking about these sort of subscription and all these other opportunities, but for me, it's about how the lowest hanging fruit for me is just making sure people understand what a podcast is, how they can access it, and how they can use it for themselves and the opportunities there for the individual podcaster and listener. Yeah.
Well, Francois, you are well placed in a fantastic position to talk to us about the sort of ad spend that's happening with podcasting, as well as on digital audio, right? So you see all of this, you've seen the growth of the industry. Could you give us some stats and some figures as well? I know you did prepare some slides.
100%. We're in load shedding, so let me know if the generator is too loud.
We can hear you.
Still hear me? Okay, brilliant. So I'm quickly going to share my screen. While I'm doing that, you guys discussed such fascinating things just now. I want to say some of our largest channels are actually local language channels. We have soapies and we've got local content, which is doing really well. Not as, not the same numbers as the English, but in terms of broad numbers, holding their own and also getting good advertising. But I think, and in terms of monetization, we see three models. Let me just go through these slides quickly. So people asked, shall I do some general stats just on what we're seeing in South Africa in terms of audience, or shall I skip that, Refilo?
I'm just looking at the clock. We've got about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Let's go to monetization. Sorry, guys.
Okay, so I've got one slide on monetization. We basically have three models that we come see. The first one is pure monetization through advertising. The second one is subscriptions. And the third one is using podcasts as a marketing mechanism. And we've got successful people, but typically a good organization will use all three. The fact about podcasting with subscription is if somebody can find the same type of content for free, they will listen to it for free. So you need to establish yourself as good enough. But I have to say, in terms of advertising, so this is just the IAB's numbers that they were tracking for podcast advertising. You see here, compound annual growth rate, 65% around 2007. Been adjusted down a little bit because of COVID. So the prediction for 2020 is down from 29.6 to 14.7%. In South Africa, we've seen an absolute explosion in advertising. We're basically already almost at what was spent last year. So, and it's still accelerating. So there's a good chance that we're going to double in terms of the amount of advertising that businesses are spending on podcast and stream advertising on digital audio. So that is very exciting. It's still small compared to radio and traditional medium. So, you're talking, sort of less than 10%, but at these type of growth rates, it's something which is going to become very viable. And I think I've got a couple of slides on COVID and how it's changed listening patterns. But the short of it is that that COVID and the whole lockdown has really pushed digital audio into the forefront. More and more people are switching over. We're seeing exciting things like our 18-year-old demographic, 18 to 24, suddenly has come back to podcasting. They're listening to stuff across the board. We've seen massive growth. So very exciting there and good place to monetize, be that through subscription or through advertising.
Sure. And a quick question, and guys, if you have any questions for Francois, please go ahead and ask them. I just want to know of the people that have heard of podcasts and actually know what they are, because of course, as Paula was saying, education about podcasting is something that needs to be done really, really heavily. How many podcasts are South Africans in general listening to weekly?
I didn't prepare the weekly numbers, but I can tell you in South Africa with a population of about 50 million, last year we had close to 6 million people on our platform through the course of the year. And sure. This is the podcast growth number. So it's a compound annual growth rate over the last 5 years, currently of 45%. So, so that's very exciting. Not as big as radio yet, but it's something which is definitely catching up.
Is there a direct correlation between ad spend on podcasts and digital audio taking away from radio ad spend? Is it direct, or are advertisers essentially just trying to check all the boxes and diversify within their advertising ecosystem?
I don't have direct data on that. I know sure. that especially since the lockdown, advertising revenue in radio has been falling. A lot of it has been moving over to digital. But I would like to think that it's additional options. Obviously, there's only one pie that needs to be sliced. But hopefully, it's not it's not competing, but it's sort of tools that a radio station can use to diversify their income streams. So, but at the end of the day, as you say, there's only so much being spent on advertising. So, some of the other industries are going to lose if audio starts picking up.
Sure. Well, as Paula, as attention merchants are trying to grab people's attention, especially during these times of COVID-19, how do podcasters set themselves apart and make themselves a welcome sort of relief or escape from the usual doom and gloom? How do podcasters take this opportunity to elevate their game?
First of all, the number of podcasts around the continent that have come out in the last few months have been incredible. I think it's the fact that COVID, we're at home, you have time to start something. Maybe podcasting is the thing I always wanted to do. So a lot of people are doing that. And we know that discoverability of podcasts is extremely difficult. And hopefully with Google Podcasts, we're an Android continent, investing more in their podcast space, the opportunities for discoverability are great. And what you're talking about is really audience development. It's what any audience development that any person on any medium would need to do. How do you connect with your audience? How do you meet them where they are? And then how do you expand from there? And there are different ways. And it's also understanding the market. And there are different ways around it. I think it really depends on who your audience is. And once I can understand who you're talking to, it's easier to figure out how you reach them. But it's a combination of being digital, being on social, and all that work, but then also offline. There's work that also happens offline. Do you have events? Do you actually connect with your audience, not on your podcast? How do you get the word out there? And some people are actually using other mediums to do it. So they'll go on radio in order to talk about their podcast and expand it. They'll use YouTube as well, which is a great space for discovery as well, to expand their audiences for their podcast. So there are different strategies that one can sort of look to expand and reach new audiences.
Kim, I'm gonna come to you and ask the same question, also bearing in mind that unfortunately, because of COVID and the various lockdowns that countries have seen, people's affordability, right, being able to buy data has been compromised, or being able to afford data has been compromised. We're sitting in a situation here in South Africa where we have one of the highest data costs on the continent. So of course, that's definitely hit the consumers in the pocket, and it's made, I guess, what Paula's talking about, discoverability, that bit more difficult. But what are the opportunities now to differentiate yourself during this period that you see?
Like I said before, I think it's going to take a lot of labor to pull it off. And I'll build on what Paula said in terms of who's your audience. I mean, I have a podcast called the FTA Master Podcast, and we mostly produce narrative nonfiction stories in English, but we do a couple in Arabic. And so people are like, well, who's your audience and who are you talking to? And, people get confused. So if you're not doing the audience research, or if you're not doing a proper proposal for your podcast and a business proposal at the same time, you'll find yourself in a bit of troubled water along the way. So on the front end, you should be doing the proper research so you can try and figure out what possibilities exist, not only to monetize, but to grow that audience in these difficult times. If people can't afford the data, or if people can't afford to subscribe to your podcast, then who's your audience? Where are your listeners? And how are you going to grow from there?
Sure. And to that end, the research looks like how, if you are starting something for yourself and you can only get this Edison Research Infinite Dow summarized version, and you can't afford to subscribe for $10,000 to that annual podcasting report, right?
Right.
Yeah. Really, really a tough one there. Chris, the sort of go-to ways in which small startups or people on the ground can start to do that research, that market research. It looks like what? What are your suggestions? To put you on the spot.
Right, put you on the spot.
You're muted. Hey, Chris, you're muted.
I got it. Sorry, it was supposed to unmute automatically, but there you go. So I would ask Francois.
Francois, the can is being kicked down the road to you.
He's the one that has the data, yes.
Sure. How do we begin to research under these difficult circumstances where we don't have huge purses, large pockets, for instance?
So I was actually answering one of the questions from Paula Diaz in the web chat. So you're asking about, can you just rephrase the question very quickly? Or repeat the question?
Okay.
We're thinking about, if we want to do.
So the question was.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Kim dropped out. But if you want to do your own market research, where should one start looking if, for instance, you can't subscribe or to Edison Research or any of those? Yeah.
That is quite a difficult question because it depends on your budget. So obviously, if you've got enough money to subscribe, then you can just either pay somebody to do the research for you or just buy the resources you need. In a cash-strapped sort of environment, somebody needs to, you need to be clever. And some people are doing their own research. Some people are talking to others who have got the information, but it's basically a function of the resources you have available and how clever you can do this. It's a little bit like marketing as well. People ask me, how do I market my podcast? And similarly, it's a function of how much money do you have, what connections do you have, how can you solve the problem? So there's not really one size fits all in my opinion there. But I would say tap into net. So let's say you're a podcaster or a broadcaster, tap into the networks that's doing this. There's a lot of people that's very excited. You've got PodMeet events, you've got the PodFest. Paula, by the way, it's great to see you on the call as well. We've also spoken in the past. And there's a lot of people that will help you. So connect to other people that's trying to solve the same problem as you.
Sure. And
can I add to that? Because at PodFest, research is actually going to be one of the biggest things we'll be investing in. And it doesn't have to start, it can start small because we already have a community of podcasters that we work with. And half the time, even the survey I talked about diaspora and podcasts, all we did is email them and ask them to fill out a survey. That was it. We had 78 people respond, and then we started from there. And then next year we'll expand because also what we're doing is we've grown, we're building a database of African podcasts. And so we have contacts of all these different podcasters around the continent. And people want to know this information, so they're willing to share their own information in order to grow. So I think everyone wants data. Like a lot of decision makers are waiting to invest in Africa, but they're waiting for data. And really, it's the people who are willing to do the heavy lifting, the hard work to go find this data, which is also an opportunity for monetization, by the way, data collection, because no one is really willing to go do it. That's why we're so hungry when Francois shares a few numbers on the screen. We're like, what's going on there? But you can also do it yourself as a podcaster. Ask your audience, whoever is listening, to fill out a survey. Ask them where they live. What are they doing? What there's all kinds of ways to collect information, and you can start small and then expand from there.
All right, Kim, I think you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, I'll just make one quick point. Universities. I mean, this is what I do in academia, and you can always look to your college professors who are teaching in media and say, hey, let's collaborate. And this is one quick way that you might be able to get some of these numbers. To build on what Paula said, you start off small and you do something incrementally. Because universities might have a small research budget that they can build on.
Yeah. Francois, you want to build on that before we move on over and take some questions? We've got 8 minutes left on the clock, and I want to get to the audience's questions.
I think I was also once more answering questions, so I think just we can move on with that.
All right, fantastic
conversation just now.
Well, whoever might want to answer this, but I'm going to start off with the super basic question, which goes, this is from Gwena, asking, how does one differentiate from an audio podcast versus video podcast like on YouTube? We've already spoken about monetizing, of course, from podcasts, but do we call video podcasts, or are they just vids?
I think it can be. It's a podcast in the format with video, but you need to make sure that you add a lot of value in your video, because on iona, our podcast, low quality podcast, is 10 megs per hour that you pay, which in video, you're talking at least 200, maybe 500 megs per hour. In Africa, that's a huge expense that you need to justify. So I think you can call both of them, but just be cautious if you go into this. Make sure that you use your data and you use your audience means optimally to be successful.
Sure. We're talking early on about strategy as well, and how to monetize. Paula saying Urban Cafe and Namibia have a great strategy in syndicating podcasts, and then also saying that Ultimate Media selling clients on the power of both, of traditional radio and digital, and saying that the best campaigns do use both. So to your point, Kim, absolutely, you need to switch it up and be as creative as possible in that regard. A question for you, Francois, because we love stats and some figures. would the question was how many downloads, or on average, the number of downloads per episode that you see on Iona, and what's good and what's bad in our context?
Yes. So we work with large radio stations, big media groups, right down to single persons doing podcasts. I think if you're a single podcaster in South Africa, if you talk about episodes, you need to look at how many episodes does this person publish per month. So normally we just work with the total amount of downloads for a channel or a show, which in South Africa, if you're in the tens of thousands per month, you start moving into the upper 10%. But there are episodes which are getting hundreds of thousands of downloads per episode. It all depends on your audience and sort of the power that you have behind your organization.
Okay. Here's one, Francois. How does Iona deal with music rights? And I guess if any of you want to chime in on the idea of, you touched earlier on, Paula, on IP, but specifically for your podcast. But when it comes to utilizing music, how does Iona deal with that, Francois?
Firstly, we give people guidance in terms of music rights because a lot of people don't understand it. But in our terms and conditions, we steer clear of it. So we say that if you upload content to Iona, you need to have the rights to make that available to us. In some cases, we will query with people whether they've got the rights to distribute. But unfortunately, the legislation around music and IP is still very complicated in the case of podcasting. So general advice there would be to steer clear of it, do proper podcasting, don't try and do a music show or something like that.
Sure. Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Kim, sorry.
I'll make it quick. Just try to find friends who can produce some